faith is true. And then when they say, but, will we be able to explain why their conjecture against Christianity doesn't really hold any water? And it's not to defeat the person in the sense of that you're no longer under their criticism, but what we're doing is the person you wrote down, we're going to try to be able to explain to them the reasonableness, the rationality, and the truthfulness behind the Christian faith. Now, what's interesting about apologetics is, like I said, it's not to be argumentative. It's not to basically win every argument, shut the mouth of all the people who are objecting to Christianity, but it's to be able to soften them to understand that the Christian faith is not ludicrous. It's actually very practical and meaningful, and it makes a lot of sense. Actually, we're going to talk about why it makes complete sense. And actually, it makes sense of the world and reality. And it's the only worldview, as we're going to talk about, that does such a thing. And we want to talk about, at the end here, the next verse in 1 Peter 3:16 talks about how to give the answer. It says, "Yet do it with meekness and respect, having a good conscience, so that in whatever thing you are spoken against, those who revile your good manner of life in Christ will be put to shame." So apologetics, as we're going to talk about here and how to do it, that there's an attitude, there's a disposition of your heart that is needed in order to be effective. You might be able to give the right answer, potentially, but if you offend the person, if you drive them away, or if you act arrogant and chauvinistic, you will make an enemy, and no matter what answer you give, you will never win them, because they will walk away feeling dejected. There's a good analogy to think about in what apologetics does in the sense of evangelistic efforts, how to reach the person that you've written down. So as we speak, Scripture, God's Word to people, as the parable of Matthew 13 says, we're sowing seed, aren't we? Well, depending upon the type of soil you sow the seed on, there's different outcomes. Think about apologetics in the way that you're sowing seed on the ground, but as you're sowing the seed, you're picking up all the branches, all the rocks, and everything that will encumber that seed from taking root. It's just basically helping the person's heart become fertile and removing the obstacles that they currently hold on to and that are preventing them from coming to Christ.
So, Jerry mentioned worldview, so why don't we define what a worldview is? Because this whole subject really revolves around this one word, worldview. And worldview, first, is a particular philosophy of life or conception of the world and reality. It's how a person views and explains reality. It's how they understand what is true about reality, and most importantly, how they then act out that reality in the world and what they believe about the world. So everything that they think, the way that they behave, all stems from their worldview. All people have worldviews. But the vast majority of people do not think about their worldview. It's not like they just, they're thinking, okay, how am I going to act today based upon, my materialist philosophy? Nobody thinks that way, right? Now, as Christians, maybe sometimes we might think, okay, well, what would Jesus do, right? And that is kind of acting out your worldview. But for the most part, people don't really think about their worldview. It just is. Worldview is like a language. It's like your native language. So you speak a particular worldview, or a particular language, and you don't really think about that language. Now, if you start learning another language, you have to think about that language. Okay, what was the word for this? What was the word for that? You have to think about the language. But your native language, you just do it. You don't think about, okay, do I put the subject in front of the verb? What is a gerund again? No, you just speak. because it's just part of who you are, right? It's how you think. Worldviews are like that. They're just part of who you are. It's your culture. It's the reality as it's ingrained in you. And it gets into you the same way language does. It's just through osmosis. It's by exposure. It's the circles that you run in, the friends that you have, the parents that you have, the schooling that you have, the entertainment that you watch. It's all of that stuff is constantly feeding you worldview. And the stuff that's sticking, that becomes the worldview that's who you are and how you see things. One way to think about this subject of worldview, I think I actually did something, but you can't see it, it's off the bottom of the thing, is to think in terms of immigrants coming into the society, right? So we've got a group of immigrants, we'll say from Southeast Asia or something like that, and they come in and they make a little Saigon, right? Somewhere in Los Angeles, they make a little Saigon, and they don't speak English, they don't really understand the culture, so they sort of stick together. And then they maybe start some businesses, make some great faux noodles. If you've ever had that, you know what I'm talking about. And over time, it's like it's their own little world inside of this other culture. And what Christians did, really kind of from about the mid-19th century on, is that. Because the culture around them was beginning to adopt a different worldview, a materialist worldview predominantly. And then we've seen those changes occur kind of in waves. Everybody looks at the 1960s and thinks, wow, things really changed in the 1960s. It was happening long before that. And today we see these whole-scale changes in our society. And what Christians did during that time was they just kind of retracted into their own little world. Right? But we're called to reach out to people. And so if we're going to do that, think about those immigrants, right? How are they going to get out of Little Saigon? They got to learn the language, right? They got to learn how to interact with people. They got to learn this culture. Why did something I just did offend you? I don't understand. They have to get to the point where they understand the culture, they understand the language, and then they can begin to interact. And we have to do the same thing. We do not live in a Christian culture today in America. We do not have a Christian culture. You may live in a Christian culture in a little bubble, but the rest of the culture is not Christian. And we'll talk a little bit later about what it is, but you've got to get out. You've got to learn about what is that culture or cultures. There's those worldviews. There's a number of them. And begin to understand that language so that you can interact and you can begin to show why Christianity is better.
So we're talking about worldviews, and that might be a new word to some of you. And it's just a way to look at the world and make sense of life. Understanding what is true, what you should do, who you should be. Everybody sees these type of things through a certain particular framework, and that's the worldview. Now, there are three main types of worldview you encounter, and a huge number of subcategories. The three main types are God exists, or a God exists. There is some type of supernatural being, or there is not, or there's some type of impersonal spiritual entity. So with theism, we could take like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, these type of worldviews. They look and they see, we understand that there is something more than just the world. That there's something beyond the world. There's a creator, or there's a God of some sort. Atheism denies this. Atheism is basically the denial of everything that does not consist of some form of physical matter. Now, pantheism is kind of a blend between the two. Pantheism is a worldview where the matter is actually looked upon as God, that everything is part of one whole. And there's a lot of different ways to see this. A lot of Native American religions will subscribe to this type of a worldview. It's been popularized in public media through movies such as Star Wars. What is the Force? The Force is in everything and everyone, and we're all part of the Force. It's a type of deity, they think, that just is composed of the universe. So when you talk to somebody, they're basically going to be part of one of these three categories. And we're going to break it down a little bit more, because atheism, as John is saying, our current culture is not a Christian culture. It's predominantly an atheistic culture. And you'll find that the most predominant form of atheism you will encounter is naturalism, which is a subcategory of materialism. Now, all these isms, there's tons of isms out there. Everybody invents new isms all the time to try and explain new niches and new certain nuances. So you have like scientism, you have empiricism. It's just, the list goes on. Now in naturalism, which is probably what most post-enlightenment thinkers who don't have a particular religious bent, is what they subscribe to. That everything in the world comes about through natural causes. And it's a form of determinism, where that things are just the result of previous causes. Your choices, everything that happens in the world, good, bad, those really don't exist. Things just happen. There's no categorizing morality in this regard. It's just that whatever occurs in the world through either just what they call blind chance, randomness, is there any other descriptive word that you would think of?
Just physical law-like processes.
Yeah, physical, natural laws. Things just happen. And a lot of people, this falls into like a subcategory of scientism where people are like, okay, let's try and study then why all these things happen. Let's come up with explanations according to natural laws to explain why we're here, why this happens, why that happens. You know, a lot of the evolutionary explanations, the Big Bang, these are explanations for core concepts of what is real and true that depend upon natural laws and natural causation. You can chime in any minute.
Okay.
Well,
so that's, you can think of, and we're going to get into this in just a minute in detail, but the idea of sort of two stories. But the naturalism is kind of a base, right? So that's the base worldview of our culture today. Then there's several different ways that can go. So if you remember the philosopher Nietzsche went with it in a particular way called nihilism. And nihilism is very bleak. It's basically, it understands that there's in naturalism and materialist philosophy, there's no meaning to anything, there's no purpose, there's no value. And nihilism goes down the path of everything is meaningless, nothing has any value, it's all bleak, it's all nothingness, right?
You might know Friedrich Nietzsche from his famous saying that God is dead. He was a philosopher that lived in back at the beginning of the 20th century. So
Yeah.
if you're not familiar with him, just trying to put it in context.
To put it in a more modern setting, for example, the Columbine killers, that would be an example of nihilists, right? So it can lead down that path. It's unusual, but it can. It can also lead down several other more common paths, but the most common path that naturalism leads down is called existentialism. And you may have heard of that term before, kind of gets thrown around. But at a very basic level, what it means is creating meaning through experience. Creating value through your experiences, right? So think about what that means then, existentialism on top of naturalism, and you'll see why I say this is the predominant worldview of our culture. What secular existentialism on top of naturalism basically means is a person who believes that everything, there's no God, it's just everything, maybe there's a God, maybe there's not, I don't know, but probably not. And everything just happens naturally, evolution occurs, all that kind of stuff. And so I'm going to live my life the way I think best way it makes me happy. And you should live your life, you should live it the way that makes you happy. And let's get along but I'm going to create value in my life by the things that I do. Now that might be hedonism, it might be sex and drugs and stuff like that, or it might be altruism. I might go join the Peace Corps, and I'm creating value by helping people, right? But I'm gaining that value by my experiences, by what I do, whether that's going to the movies on a date, or by writing a book about how to be better at the 5 best things to be better at, right? And I'm creating value through my experiences. And that's the predominant, it's a very individualistic kind of worldview, and that's the predominant worldview. It's also relativistic. It's what's good for you is good for me, what's good for me is good for all of you. What's good for you is good for you, and what's good for me is good for me, and what you may like, I may not like, what I like, you may not like, but that's our choices, right? So that's secular existentialism.
So John, maybe a way to relate this to some of the younger folks here is like, think about taking selfies, right, and posting on Instagram. It's all about, what am I doing in the moment? The social media stuff, maybe you could take a little bit further.
There's a fine line, for example, for Christians with modern praise and worship music, right? Modern praise and worship music can be very wonderful. It can really help you enter into a place of genuine worship with God. Or it can be about my experience, right? I want to go to that church, not that church, because over at this church, I have a better experience. That's actually that existentialism coming out that's been trained into that person.
The example of the word for that's called sensationalism. And so when churches try to play off of people's experiential emotions as the most important aspect of a worship experience, they say it's sensationalism because they play on the senses. It's how you experience it is really the most important thing in a personal, in the moment type of experience. Now, what's interesting is a worldview basically explains 4 major categories. I got this from Ravi Zacharias, if you guys know who he is. He's a very famous Christian apologist. And he says that worldviews explain origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. The answer to those 4 questions, is what a worldview explains. And what has happened is naturalism and the secular existentialism have paired up to explain those questions in like a combo type of fashion. Naturalism has been the predominant explanation now for what? Origin, where we come from, and where we're going. Nowhere, basically. Because there's nothing else after death. Existentialism, secular existentialism, explains meaning and morality. Now, it might be completely subjective to each person, but that's what people draw on. And we're going to explain now how those 2 worldviews have combined and formed this dichotomy between reality that has led to a lot of problems. One Christian apologist and writer, Nancy Pearcey, who is a disciple and student of Francis Schaeffer, the Christian philosopher, they come with this explanation called a 2-story model of truth. And as you see, we have like this house, and in the 2nd floor are values, things that we value, what is important to us in life. And that would be morality, meaning, our desires, and things like that.
Religion.
Things that are a lot of cognitive things that you hold in your mind that you think are important, but are just really important to you. Existentialism says that you are the source of what is meaningful. You determine meaning, as John was just explaining. And that's different from fact in the lower story. This is where naturalism explains, okay, so what actually really is real? Facts are what you can see, smell, taste, touch, and hear. And we can explain things through natural causation. And so what this 2-story model of truth has done is taken away our actual physical existence in this world and separated it from what is ultimately true, where our values come from. So they're saying values aren't actually really part of this world. It's more like an invention. It's more like something that we all develop in order to make ourselves feel good or to be part of a social culture and fit in.
So, a few years ago, how I got into this particular subject and really began to care about it was I read an article about something that the California legislature had done. This was, transgenderism is in the news big time these days, but this was before that really occurred. It was the very beginning of that process a few years ago. And this article basically talked about how the California legislature had passed a law, the governor had signed it, that allowed students, high school students, it may have been junior high school, I don't remember now, but high school students to be able to determine on their own their gender without any kind of, going to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist or anything like that. They could just decide, and they could do it, they could change. If one day they felt one way and another day they felt another way, that they were the only ones who could determine what that was, and that the school could not prevent them from using the facilities of the gender that they identified with. So, a 16-year-old boy could decide one day on his own, without anybody telling him otherwise, I'm a girl today, I'm going in the girls' locker room. Right? Now, I read this article and I thought, these people have lost their minds. They've absolutely gone insane. And the part, I've seen a lot of insanity in my lifetime, like that kind of stuff, but this was an entire state legislature and a governor passing this if they had, at least in the law, had something about, you got to have a doctor's note, right? You have to have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria from a psychiatrist or something like that, right? I might have been able to understand, right, why the legislature passed the law. But the way they did it was such a complete and utter mystery to me. How in the world can you possibly think that was a good idea? That makes no sense to me whatsoever. So it was after I learned this, two-story model of truth that I gained understanding. What's happening in our society is there's this tension. Because this is a false worldview, there's a tension between the fact and the value stories. There's a tension between naturalism and existentialism. And in some ways in our society, naturalism has dominated for 150 years. But what's happening in our society now is existentialism is winning the day, right? And more of the things that before were in that fact story are being drawn up into the value story. And guess what one of those things is? Gender, right? So instead of gender being a fact, it's drawn up by the culture and the worldview into value, right? Well, values are subjective. They're determined individually. And nobody can tell you what your value is in an existentialist worldview. Only you determine that. And so what it illustrated is you have an entire legislature that thinks this way, that this is true for them. And so, over the past few years, as I've studied this, more and more of the craziness going on in our society has at least made sense in that I understand why. And that's part of why this stuff is so valuable and so important for all of us as Christians to understand, because it's the language, remember? It's learning to speak that language so I know, that's what that means. And because that's the only way then you can enter into a conversation with a person and help them see that doesn't work, which we're going to get into in a minute.
The problem with the adoption of these incorrect worldviews is that it has led to people relativizing everything, as John is talking about, specifically morality. Gender identity has become blurred, but even more than that, a lot of what we would consider to be culturally acceptable practices is in complete fluctuation. It's in complete fluctuation based upon usually popular vote, as in the California legislation. Racism has become that now, trans racism. People have begun to find that wherever I want to circle myself on the chart of existence is my own prerogative. I choose where to place myself. There's no ultimate understanding of who I am, where I come from, what type of person I would be categorized as based upon even biological factors such as pigment color maybe, hair color. If you want to be blonde, if you want to be brunette, you can just say you are and it's supposed to then be accepted. Furthermore, the idea that these worldviews bring, the consequence, one of the most major consequences, is the idea that it is an assault on the things that are sacred, really. One of those being human life and sexuality. That if there is no ultimate direction for what is right according to handling human life or being sexually active as a species, then everybody can choose exactly what they feel is the right way to live as a human. There is no exterior sort of basis. There's no reference point. That's the problem with existentialism, is that it's a floating reference point. And so one of the things that we want to inspire you guys to see in our conversation right now is that understanding the way people think in our culture is critical to being able to dialogue with them. Because you might say, that's crazy to the California legislation. Well, okay, so what's so crazy about it? That's for the answer. What answer do you have for them? How can you then talk to them and understand where they're coming from so that you can then meet them where they're at? Basically, it's how can you lead somebody out of the world they're in unless you first enter into it? That's in any aspect of life, not just apologetics and the Christian faith and things like that.
One of the great things about Christianity, once you kind of understand this idea that our society has this two-story model of truth, is that Christianity blends the two back together. Right? That there is no difference between fact and value. They're integrated. Piercy's primary book on this subject is called Total Truth. And that's the idea, is that bringing it all back, instead of a separated truth, value truth, fact truth, it's brought back together in a meaningful and real way. So that one of the things about worldviews is they're supposed to explain reality. And false worldviews will explain parts of reality and will fail to explain other parts of reality. And we'll get into a little bit more detail on that in a few minutes. But a true worldview must be able to explain all of reality. And Christianity is the only worldview that explains all of reality. And so we have to understand their language, where they're coming from, so that we can begin to help them to bridge that gap and get to the place where they see that, the worldview that they're caught up in, that language that they speak, doesn't actually reflect reality in its totality.
Usually these false worldviews are able to answer a couple of the major questions of reality. But as apologists, and in the sense of lay apologists, that we're all in the business of being evangelists and have to give answers for ourselves, is finding out where do those worldviews fall short. And in a little bit, we're going to do some scenarios and some role-playing to help demonstrate the type of thinking that is really imperative to be able to help these people understand how their worldview falls short, where the contradictions are at, or the nonsensical explanations that they give.
So let's talk about the objectives. All right, so we're going to talk about tactics of apologetics. We're not going to spend a lot of time on content of apologetics today. That is a gigantic subject, and there's a lot of stuff you guys already know in terms of the content of apologetics, the whys of the truth of Christianity, right? So we're not here to do that. But we do want to talk about some of the tactics, because the tactics can be just as important. If you're not tactical in how you approach this, even though you have the truth, the other person probably isn't listening, and they're not going to hear what you say. We were talking about something earlier, and it made me think about a saying that I heard, that people will probably not remember what you say to them, but they almost always will remember how you made them feel. Right? And the say is the content, that feel part is the tactic. Right? Is how did that come about? So we have some objectives for the tactics of apologetics. The first is demonstrating a concern for the other person's life. I actually have to love them. I can't pretend to love them. I can't, okay, I'll muster up. All right, God, I know you said love your enemy. I will try not to hate them. That doesn't work. And people know it. You know, people are not stupid. They know when you actually genuinely care about them and when you are just trying to win at a game. And so you have to get to the place where it's not a game. I genuinely care about the other person.
Yeah, one thing that I would say everybody needs to keep in mind is that apologetics is not about you, and if it is, you're going to do it wrong, and you're going to hurt somebody. There's nothing like burning a bridge because you want to make sure that they knew you were right, and you had the answers. Anybody ever fired back a response to somebody with a little bit of an attitude, and it sort of just blew up a situation? Oh yeah. Well, apologetics is basically like you're walking on dynamite, and if it's about you, you're just lighting matches and dropping them. And at some point, you're going to blow yourself up, and your friend or whoever you're talking to. So you really do have to have in mind that the answers you're giving are not to defend yourself. We talk about defending the Christian faith and giving the answers. It's not to toot your own horn. It's not to parade yourself around as being like, I got things right, you're the one screwed up, let me fix you. Our attitude has to be that we're trying to help them. We want them to be able to come to a complete understanding of their life so they can live it the way God intends them to live it, so they can realize that there is this explanation for why we're here, what we're doing, where we're going. And that's the kind of heart we need to have when we do apologetics.
Jerry, quick question. Because you're talking about a lot of times something that's in people's value system, aren't you, in a sense, almost creating a situation where the probable outcome could be negative?
Yeah, I mean, you're in a very delicate balance a lot of times because religion, personal values are usually very close to a person, and they easily get offended if you sort of, especially an existential type of attitude, that if you sort of begin to have a negative slant toward an individual's worldview, they could immediately feel like you're being critical, you're being judgmental, you don't even want to understand me. So you're right, there's a teeter-totter, and you have to be very careful how you balance that, especially initially, until you build more trust with the person, and they know that you have their interests at heart.
One of the things that can be challenging about this is it's such a broad subject, there's so much to know, and all this kind of stuff, and you've got this person that you care about, and you want to, and so you can become, especially if you gain a bunch of knowledge, you can become a little overzealous and try and do everything all at once. And that generally is not going to be successful. So, as Greg Kokel puts it in his book, Tactics, just try to put a pebble in their shoe. That's the idea. Put a pebble in their shoe. What happens to you when you get a pebble in your shoe and you're walking around with a pebble in your shoe? You're thinking about the pebble in your shoe. Are you thinking about anything else? No. You're just thinking about the pebble in your shoe, right? And that's what we want to do. We just want to put a pebble in their shoe. Right? We want to get them to think about something. So maybe we got them to think about, they have a particular view on something, and we put a pebble in their shoe, and they're thinking, that doesn't really sound stupid. I know, but it's okay, we'll wash the dishes. You know, they're just going to think about it when you're not around, right? That's all. I don't have to get them saved at that moment. If I do, awesome. But I don't have to, right? If I could just get them to think a little bit more about something, then I've accomplished a great goal. And if it's somebody that I'm close to, maybe I'm kind of continually doing that. There's a great book by Greg Boyd called Letters from a Skeptic. And it's an exchange of letters between himself and his dad, who was an atheist. And Greg is a pastor. And they go back and forth in these letters over the course of several years. And Greg had invited his dad to say, hey, ask me any question you want. I want to interact with you. I want to interact with you on this subject. Let's do it through letters. Ask me any question. Don't hold back. And over the course of the next several years, they just went through this process, and Greg was putting pebbles in his dad's shoe, and eventually his dad got saved. Right? But it was a long process of that took place.
Yeah, actually, Greg Boyd's journey with his father, if you ever read that book, it's actually really amazing the kind of gentle and meek approach he took to some of the most caustic or, harsh questions that people usually ask of Christianity or accuse Christians of being like. And I do highly recommend it. The thing about these worldviews and the scenarios that we're going to play and the pebble in the shoe is that it's kind of like if you look to try to take down an entire person's worldview in one swoop, it's like trying to take down an elephant. You can throw many spears or whatever, and it's not going to go down. It's just a huge beast. But if you very carefully injure the elephant, you can take down an elephant in a couple little quick maneuvers. Over in Africa, when they hunted elephants, I love elephants, by the way, so don't get me wrong on this, but if you cut the tendons on the back of the elephant's legs, it'll topple. A few real careful attacks, and these people can just, with a small band of people, can take down a massive elephant. And that's kind of a worldview. We're looking just to speak those questions into people's lives that will end up being the Achilles heel of the elephant. But apologetics, as we're trying to say, it can be a two-edged sword. It's more like a hammer, maybe, if you want to look at it. What you do is you try to equip somebody to be able to build a new understanding of reality. And you do it one nail at a time. But how many people can smash a window with a hammer or break a vase? You can wield a hammer however you want. It can be very destructive. So it's a tool, and how we use it is going to be very imperative on whether or not we're going to be successful with the people that we're looking to help, the person that we wrote the name down on our paper.
So for your apologetics tactical toolbox, your first two most important tools are love and patience. Love and patience. You've got to love that person, you've got to be patient with the process.
Yeah, Greg Boyd's journey took over 3 years with his father. That's a lot of patience. Okay, so how do you do apologetics? Well, the one thing that we want to help you guys out with is the most fundamental aspect of discussing religion or worldviews, and that's to ask the right questions. Now, there's no definitive way to ask a specific right question. It's more or less a way of thinking. It's a way of helping the other person think. You want to do the
Yeah, sure. All right, so those of you who are old enough to remember or like TV Land, you may have seen a show called Columbo, right? And so Columbo was a detective that he had this particular approach and demeanor where he would come in, he'd almost apologize for asking questions of his intended victims, the suspects, where they'd be taken off guard, they wouldn't realize where he was coming, and they're answering his questions. I mean, here he's a detective, he's investigating a murder, they're the murderer, and they're answering the detective's questions. And the reason they're answering is because they're looking at this guy, this guy's an idiot. And But the Columbo question basically worked like this. Help me to understand something, because I just don't understand it, right? That was the typical kind of Columbo question. So a Columbo question is what's called a clarifying question. This is very important, because if you're going to properly interact with somebody in another worldview, you have to understand what they mean and where they're coming from. The only way to do that is to genuinely, it's the key word, genuinely ask them, what do they mean? Right? I'm not asking, at this point anyway, we'll get into a question where you are trying to lead it in a particular direction. But at this point, I'm not trying to lead them, I'm trying to understand them. And that's what Columbo questions are about. Because people will often make statements. There's a particular phenomenon that we all experience called the curse of knowledge. Right? The curse of knowledge is where one person has something in their head that the other person doesn't have. And when the person who has the thing in their head talks about that something, they're leaving things out in what they're saying. But in their mind, all the gaps are filled in. So when this phenomenon was first studied, the way they did some of the studies was they would take two students, and they'd have one of the students rap out a song, a very common song like Star Spangled Banner or something like that, Happy Birthday or something, on a table. And then the other person was supposed to listen and determine what song were they rapping out. And then both parties were supposed to guess at whether they thought the other person understood, whether they thought that they understood what it was, and then they came up with percentages. And I don't remember exactly what the percentages were, but it was something like this. That the person who rapped it out thought that the other person got it about 75% of the time. The other person who was listening thought they got it right about 25% of the time. The actual amount of time that they got it was less than 5%. Now, why is that? Okay, so if you just think about this, if you rap out on a table, okay, I'm going to rap out something on the table right now, so we'll just do this. You all got it, right? America the Beautiful? Because that's what I heard in my head. Right? That's the curse of knowledge. I'm hearing the song in my head, and I hear it when I'm rapping out. All you hear is the rap out. You don't hear the song in your head. Right? What a Columbo question is intended to do is bring the song out of the other person's head. Right? So that you are both on the same page. I get what you're saying now. I understand. Because you don't know which way to go yet. Because you don't really understand them yet. And by doing this part of the process, you can demonstrate the love for them. Because people love it when they're listened to. When people actually take the time and effort to care about what they think. They go, oh, this person really does care about me. Right? And so this is why it's a good place to begin. And in fact, it may be the only place you go. That person may answer your question, well, how do you understand what you mean by X? And then they tell you, and you're like, I've never heard of that before. I have no idea where to go with this. Right? That's a good place to stop. Because anything you say at that point is probably going to be useless.
The idea behind beginning to ask questions is, first of all, it opens a conversation where you guys can continue to dialogue rather than just they accuse you or say something against Christianity and they want you to then now respond and defend the reason why you think you're right. The idea of asking questions is to divert the attention on you to more of the concepts they're trying to present to you. First of all, to be able to understand what exactly they're trying to say, because most of the time there's a whole bunch of implicit underlying assumptions from the curse of knowledge and other causes that you probably have no idea about, and if you presume to know, you're going to be making your own assumptions that probably you guys are going to be talking apples and oranges by the time minute 2 comes around. There's another type of question that you can offer, and this one has to be done very carefully. because it could lead to the explosion of the conversation in a detrimental way. And it's called taking the roof off questions. This is an expression that comes from Francis Schaeffer, and he developed this idea of asking these questions as questions that lead the person to the ultimate outworking of their premise. For example, what actually really does that mean if you take it all the way and you look at how it applies on a broad scale? And we're gonna give you instances of these two different types of questions. The idea of taking the roof off is basically you want to be able to ask the person, do you really mean all of this? They might give you a certain specific question or a phrase or whatever, and in a small little, maybe their particular nuance, it might seem to be true and they think it's true, but then you take it and you extrapolate it. You basically push it all the way to the end and be like, do you know where this leads? This leads all the way over there. So like, do you mean this? Do you mean to suggest this? Like, and they might say yes, they might say no, and from there you can move on. But I think we're going to now give some scenarios on how these questions look and how you can begin to enter into the asking the questions in just a normal conversing manner.
Notice as we go through this couple of scenarios here, that one of the things that it's really important for your question to do is get the focus off of yourself. Okay? As long as you're defending, you're losing. Right? You need to get them to defend their position, and questions are how you do that. So watch that in the interaction we're going to do here. Watch that process taking place, and then we also want you guys to participate. So as we go through this, as we say some stuff, and one of us is going to be the atheist, the other one's going to be the Christian, and notice I point to myself. If you think of a question that would be really good, we want you to raise your hand, right? And we want to hear, okay, well, what question would you ask, right? Or how would you respond to that, right? Or is there something you heard somebody say in response to something one of us said? Okay, I don't remember who was who.
You're going to start off, you said, as the Christian.
I'm the Christian the first one. Okay. Okay, well then that means that you have the...
Yep. Okay, so in instance, we're going to do an instance of a clarifying question. I'm going to give a premise from an atheistic perspective, or a naturalist, or existentialist. Okay, so take this. Here we go. You Christians believe that gay marriage is wrong? That's just your opinion.
So, how do you understand, what do you mean that it's just my opinion?
I mean that you guys say that two people, man and man or woman and woman, can't love each other.
So do you mean that by my opinion, that my opinion is bad and your opinion is good? I don't understand.
So at this point, what did he just do? He's asking me why I'm making the distinction that I'm making. And that's important because usually in every single type of argument that is given, this is one of the underlying premises, is that good and bad or right and wrong here, the person means them in a certain way. And for the Christian, they're trying to want the person to say, how are you defining that? What is your basis for saying your opinion or you're wrong? So how could John, if I say, well, my opinion is, well, I don't think that people should treat each other that way. How would you then come back on that type of a response? Like he says, what do you mean by your opinion? And I say, well, it's what I think. Does anybody have a question that could then further discussion to help me understand that I'm being very subjective in what I'm claiming to be right and wrong?
What do you base that on?
Yeah, what's your basis?
Those are good.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What are you basing that on? Help me understand where you're coming from on that. It's always a great question.
How did you come to that conclusion?
How did you come to that conclusion? It's kind of the same thing, and it's great because what you're doing is you're inviting them to give you more detail about their opinion, which helps you in the whole process.
I like to use the question, how specific on somebody else. So to make them go into, maybe out of emotional, into have to give me real concrete answers and to substantiate their position. How specifically do you think my position is wrong?
Yeah, and you can also use, asking for specifics is really good when you're trying to get someone who has made some sort of generality about something to get them to discuss it in a more concrete way. So, all Christians are hypocrites. Really, can you give me an example of that? Now, John has a great story. One time a lady at a dinner table said, the Bible is full of contradictions. And he came back to her, can you give me an example of that? And she couldn't, right? I probably could have, but she couldn't. And immediately, so yeah, specifics are great.
The other thing about asking the questions is you're helping the person think through probably what they've never thought through themselves before. A lot of people make statements superficially, with a superficial understanding, such as, well, the Bible's full of contradictions, when they maybe have no idea if that statement really is true or not. They just heard it a lot. It's pop culture. Or somebody else said it to them. You'd be surprised how many people just absorb positions in their life and beliefs based upon hearsay, almost. They thought, well, that could be true. And then before they know it, they're actually subscribing to or affirming it for themselves without actually really thinking through why they're siding with that particular position. So asking questions helps people think for themselves, which might seem silly, but it's actually true. A lot of people, even including myself, John, would you also testify? There are things that we really haven't thought through until somebody asks us the questions.
Yes. Just had breakfast this morning while I was doing that.
You want to switch the roles?
Okay, I haven't heard that before, David. Yeah, let's do the second one.
Yeah, okay, so we're going to give you an instance of taking the roof off. And I'm going to be the Christian this time.
Okay. So pay attention to how I'm going to attack him, right? And try to make him defend his position, and he's going to reverse it with a question and put it back on me to defend my position. That's the critical thing, the critical takeaway from.
But it's not an aggressive attack.
It's not aggressive. It's genuine.
It's pointing out illogicalities and incongruencies.
It's verbal jujitsu. Okay.
Did you guys practice that?
All right. You Christians say that you're supposed to love everyone, but at the same time you say that you should spank your children. I don't see how you can love your children and abuse your child at the same time.
Wait. Didn't you tell me that you believe that people are simply biological machines and our decisions and everything are just the result of random chemical processes?
Yeah, so?
So, in your view, isn't demonstrating an action of love and an action of hate toward your child, or loving them, or spanking and abusing them, isn't that just something that your brain comes up with randomly? That there's no actual decision behind it? It's already been determined by your chemistry?
Okay. There's the pedal that just went in my shoe.
And the thing about the naturalist worldview, which is this is basically undermining that, because in a naturalist worldview, we are just biological machines. We act according to our DNA programming and according to natural influences in our environment. And so therefore, free will is really not an actual reality. it's more of like a pseudo-reality that we try to just say we actually make choices, but our physical constitution is just driven by instinct.
In an atheistic worldview, everything is just physics and chemistry, and that's all that exists. Right? So you as a person don't actually exist. You don't have free will. You're just a machine operating according to chemical and physical processes. And law-like processes and random events and responding to stimuli in that chaotic environment. That's what we all are in that view, right? But there's a lot of problems with that, right? So, for instance, one of the things you can say about, the example that we just give is, how can a chemical process be wrong? If I'm spanking my child and you think that that's a chemical process that's just operating, I don't determine that. I don't freely choose that. It's just predetermined according to events that have occurred and chemical processes and all that kind of stuff. How can that be wrong? Because they're saying it's wrong. That's what they said. But in their view, there's no such thing as wrong. There's only, this is the way I like to put it, there's only vinegar and baking soda mixing together, making a fizz. That's all it is. It's just fizz. The love for your child is simply fizz. The hate for your enemy is just fizz. Right? Now, obviously, you start putting it that way, it's like, wow, that's really dumb. That's a stupid idea. And it is. But remember, I love this person, and so I'm not going to call them stupid. I'm not going to say their ideas are stupid. I'm going to help them to see that their ideas are stupid.
Taking the roof off, the expression by Schaefer, comes about in the sense of, you're going to, let's say you're inside the house, and there's a storm, and you're protected as long as you're inside the house. You don't feel the rain, you don't feel the hail, it seems it's all out there. Taking the roof off, what it does is literally you're ripping the roof off of their metaphorical house, and you're letting the rain and hail into their home. And usually when it hits home like that is when you start to think then. They start to think, they're like, what? That doesn't quite make a lot of sense when you put it that way. So, at that point though, there's a pebble in their shoe. If things don't make sense to you, do you think about them? Do you want life to make sense? Yeah. See, when they get to the point where they're like, that doesn't quite make sense when you put it like that, usually the person's conscience cannot let that go. Usually they will begin to mull it over. And either they will dismiss it and ignore it and just live with the tension, or they'll pursue it. And they'll pursue it further. And that's when you can facilitate that journey. That's what apologetics is. You're facilitating the cultivation of their heart to be receptive to the worldview that explains reality, which is the Christian faith. How about we do one more, and let's see if you guys can then come up with the response question to what the scenario is here. So, I'm going to come to my Christian friend here that I know, and one of my friends, we're at work, one of my friends, he was telling me that I shouldn't be living with my girlfriend. This is not right. I don't know why he says that, because if I want to live with my girlfriend, is there anything wrong with being with her? So
help me out.
If I'm trying to say, who's to say that I can't live with my girlfriend and have a relationship with her, and then have a relationship with another girl the next week, or both at the same time? Does anybody have a potential question that they could ask me to get me to think about, is there anything wrong with this picture? Is there anything wrong with my life choices? Or can I just do what I want because it's my life? Yes?
What would happen if the shoe was on the other foot?
What do you mean? Oh, that's your question.
What would happen
Okay.
if the shoe was on the other foot?
Whose
What
foot?
would happen if the shoe was on the other foot?
I think I would probably be wearing my shoes backwards.
How specifically would you do that?
Well, I would take one off like this, I'll take the other one off, and I would switch them around like
We're
that.
talking about your girlfriend, not you.
Okay, so I'll go back to my question. Back to you. What do you mean? So that's my response. What do you mean?
It's basically what I was asking. I was being silly.
You're asking why that's wrong. What would happen if it was her wanting to date other men or have other partners? How would you feel about that?
That's fine.
Well, I just want to live with my girlfriend.
Yeah,
And she wants to live with me, so I don't see the problems.
we're having fun. What's the big idea? Nothing wrong with that.
What would your mother say?
Right.
I wouldn't know where to go with that, so I might just ask the person to explain why they thought it was okay, just to get
Gold.
What was that?
You win.
I would, because I wouldn't know where to go with that, I would just ask him to explain why he believed it was okay to get more information out.
See, when I say that I think it's perfectly fine, why do I think it's fine? You guys have no idea probably why I think it's fine. It might be fine because I was brought up that way. It might be fine because I'm part of a religion where multiple partners are expected or approved of. Or it might be because I'm wanting to satisfy my personal sexual desires and have no intention of making any commitment. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons I could have. So asking why helps her, helps you guys, helps John, whoever I'm conversing with, helps them know what's going on here. What's ticking? What's making me conclude these matters in the way I am? Yeah.
Another way to ask that is when, rather than why. When did you first have that idea? And it's a less threatening way, and it gives you some of that same background. The person could say, well, when I became a Mormon.
Okay, so this is a good point to make. Sometimes you need time to think, right? And when you're in the position where you're like, oh my God, I don't know how to handle this situation, right? Just ask a question like that, right? Well, when did you guys first decide to do that? You know, and you're just stalling at that point, right? Because you're not really sure. You're going to get more information, and that's part of the process. But at the same time, sometimes you just ask a question. It's like, I'm not really sure what to say here, and so I'm going to buy some time by asking a question that just fills in more of the information.
Well, it could be that the person's always thought that way, but it gets them to think about when they first thought that way too.
Yeah, and sometimes that's true as well. That you get what he was saying was that when you ask a when question, sometimes it can to make them think. The way to put it that in that vein that makes it real clear is, when did you come up with that idea? Another way would be to say, where did you get that idea? Right? You're trying to ask for the source, and frequently they don't know what the source is, and so now they're thinking about, okay, where did I get that? It seems like there's one more.
All the questions I hear the devil's advocate asking implies that he doesn't understand what Christianity is about in the first place. He's implying that Christianity is just about do's and don'ts, right and wrong, various teachings. No, I say Christianity is a matter of who you follow, and what you believe after that is to be the result of following Jesus.
Yeah, I think that can't be the first place you go, though, because, for example, you believe what the Bible says, you think it's true, right? I believe in tooth fairies, and I think that's true.
Well, who taught me the Bible in the first place? Am I going to just believe in the Bible because some evangelist said so, or am I going to go by the Holy Spirit?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I clearly understand. And that is a place you'll have to get to in the conversation. But all that is, though, are assertions. And assertions are just positions that you take. And whether you agree with me or not is the conclusion of that the matter.
Let me stop at this point and make a gigantic caveat statement. if you raise somebody from the dead, pull them out of a wheelchair, cure their blindness or whatever, you don't need any of this apologetic stuff. If you are working with the Holy Spirit and the Holy Spirit tells you, go heal that person's sister from Down syndrome, that person will listen to every word you say from that point forward. Right? That's true. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen most of the time. And most of the time, it's the same thing that Peter was talking about. That we need to be prepared to give an answer for the hope that's in us. The whys. And the person who's skeptical that we love, and we prayed, but there's nothing happening there. But there's all kinds of opportunities to interact with them. Then that's why this is important. But I will agree, my first hope is that I can demonstrate the power of God in that person's life, because that's always going to trump anything else. Now, in some cases, they may still be skeptical, but I think if that's the case, you heal them from some disease in the name of Jesus, and they still won't believe, probably not going to believe me about, why Christianity is better than secular humanism.
You could give the best reasons in the world, and if they're unconvinced by the miraculous power of God, I don't know if you're going to convince them just by sheer argumentation that you have better explanations than they have ever heard before.
Yeah, Dave.
One of you mentioned, giving things time, and that kind of hit me because that would be a great metric to measure whether or not you have moved away from love and patience and slipped over into maybe arrogance or argumentative. Because many times I have talked or conversed with people or whatever you want to call it, and I expected an immediate response or an immediate answer for them to immediately get it, because I thought maybe, I'm so logical, they're just stupid. That's not love. That's a great way, a great metric to measure whether you're still in patience and in love.
Yeah, usually thinking that they're just stupid is not love. Usually. Okay, let's move to our last section here.
Sure. I'll take the first one, okay?
Okay.
So, when we're talking about truth, we're talking about total truth, values and facts being explained by one system, one worldview. There's a 5-step process you can go through to find out what that person's worldview is and how they explain truth. The first step that I'll explain here is called identifying the idol. And what this is finding out what the person is pointing to that they're using as the basis to explain the world and reality. What is the item or the person or the mechanism or idea that they use that says this concept or explanation is what I believe gives credence to such and such a belief? Now, for a naturalist, that explanation is basically matter. That the world is the explanation. We are here because of the world. What do I mean? What do they usually mean by that? And what am I saying? So, what they're saying is that we came from the world. The idea that somehow, through random chance and unexplainable causation, a singularity exploded and caused the universe to come into being. And then from there, through some billions of years of potential random chemical interactions, life started and has progressively gotten more complex and intelligent, and voila, here we stand. That rather than pointing to a creator or another explanation, they say matter is the basis. Physics and matter, and their interactions explain all that we see and all that we experience. Go to the next one? Sure.
Okay, so whatever you have identified as the idol, their explanation as the cause of all reality, a false worldview, a false idol, is not able to explain all aspects of experience and reality. Whatever part that it's not able to explain will be reduced to nothing. Okay? Because it can't explain it. So the way you say it is, well, therefore it doesn't exist. And so I took a whole part of reality and just said, even though, yeah, we experience that in reality, it doesn't actually exist. That, whatever that is, has been reduced. This is called reductionism. Right? So, for example, in materialism, human beings are just complex machines. They have no free will and no actual mind. They just have a brain doing chemical things, right? That's materialism. Well, okay, so I just named a couple of things that the philosophy and the worldview of materialism reduces from actual experience. How many of you had lunch today?
I don't know.
Okay. When you went to lunch, how many of you sat down and allowed the chemical processes in your brain to predetermine what you ordered from the menu? Or, well, and that happened to me. I saw barbecue chicken pizza on the menu, and I thought, okay, I have to have that. I have no choice.
Sometimes my stomach makes that decision for me.
Most of us, anyway, we sat down and we looked at the menu and we went, I want that. Right? I don't want that. I made a choice. So I actually experienced my own free will. But materialism says, no, you didn't. No, you didn't. My mind, I thought in my mind, what do I want? I want that barbecue chicken pizza because anytime I see that on the menu, I'm going to eat that. I like that. I don't like that other thing, whatever that was. And I'm thinking those processes. I made a little joke with my son Nathan about it, right? And I'm thinking, my mind is contemplating lunch. But a materialist is going to say, that doesn't exist. That mind that you have, that no, that's not actually happening. So here's the problem. So Piercy, for instance, in her book, Finding Truth, she writes, when we define God as a something instead of a someone, we will tend to treat humans as a something too. This is where it gets really dark and really nasty. This is why the 20th century was the bloodiest century in human history. Why more human beings were murdered by their own governments in the 20th century is because of materialism. It's because the value of human life had been reduced to material. Right? So, first we identify the idol, and then we identify what aspects of that don't explain reality, and what do they do with that? And typically what they do is they reduce it to nothing.
The third one is to identify how the worldview doesn't reflect our experience or contradicts experience. And John kind of touched on a little bit of it with free will and having a mind. But another one would be good and evil. The idea, if somebody says that there is good and there is evil, well, there are a lot of worldviews that might use the Latin language, but their worldview doesn't support it. A lot of Eastern religions are like this, particularly Buddhism. There is no such thing as good and evil in a Buddhist worldview. There is only suffering. And the whole objective is to be free of desires so that you end suffering and attain enlightenment and enter nirvana, including even love. Love is looked at as a very negative experience and something that causes you to be attached to the earthly physical world and prohibits you from entering nirvana. And so these ideas of good and evil don't exist in those worldviews. And so if somebody starts talking about that and they hold this worldview, you can identify that their worldview isn't lining up with what they experience in the world, and what you can then point out to them if they talk about good and evil as a contradiction to their worldview. Some people, they say they hold a worldview or they talk about things with a certain worldview, not even knowing that they contradict themselves. So step 3 is to identify how their worldview really doesn't hold up to their experience of life.
The next one is to identify how the worldview self-contradicts, how it blows itself up, because it makes competing claims or it's internally not consistent. So the easy one to pick on here is postmodernism, when it says there are no absolute truths. Is that an absolute? Thank you. I knew somebody would say it. Is that absolutely true? Right? Boom. It just destroyed itself. So that's an example of self-contradiction. It's contradicting itself. Another example, this is the biggie, right? In all of apologetics and philosophy, this is the biggie. How does your worldview actually know something? And almost all worldviews destroy themselves on this question, right? So let's go back to materialism for a minute, right? How does materialism, that doesn't think that mind actually exists, how does it know that? Yeah. You don't actually have a mind if you're just chemical processes, then your materialism is simply a chemical process. It doesn't have truth, it's just fizz. So how do you actually know that? Right? And it just destroyed itself.
C.S. Lewis, I remember, I forget which work he wrote this in, but it was very interesting because he said, when in talking about the naturalistic process of the world and the way that naturalists think, he said, if things were really caused all by natural laws and everything, then I would have never come to the point of questioning if that were actually true. And the idea of being able to reflect internally on what we think, thinking as a mind, is actually incoherent in a naturalist worldview. Thought, actually, that's one of the explanations that naturalists, they don't have an explanation for consciousness. Like the actual conscious mind. They don't have an explanation for where it came from. It's one of those giant loopholes that are taboo that they don't want to touch. The fifth one is, okay, now how does Christianity resolve the issue? Truth, in its ultimate sense, explains reality. If something is true, it will correspond to life. Nancy Pearcey writes, when talking to people trapped in a secular worldview, we can help them to see that it gives no basis for the realities of life that they themselves care most about. The very fact that they cannot lie within its cramped confines is a sign that they were made to live in a larger, richer conceptual universe. Secularism is too small for secularists. We should begin by expressing solidarity with their deepest longings for meaning and significance, and then show that in a biblical worldview, those longings are not merely illusions or useful fictions, but living realities.
So this process that we just kind of went through, this actually comes from Nancy Pearcey's book, Finding Truth. It's a great tool. And we're going to wrap things up, and we'll give you some books that we both have found value in. But just to kind of recap, I want you to think back to the person, right? The person that you wrote down, the person that you thought about, right? So why this stuff is important is that person, and people like that person, like him or her. That person is why we want to get good at this stuff. It's why we want to train in this stuff. But remember, we've had some good lessons here. If you take nothing else away other than, to love people enough to ask questions to gain understanding of them, you've made a lot of progress. But it's a big subject, and it takes time and effort. It takes training. So one of the things that that we've been doing, Jerry and I have been doing for several months now. It's leading up to next spring, the next 20s and 30s conference. It's going to be focused on apologetics. So what we're doing is twice a month, we're doing an online apologetics training. And and we're recording those videos. You can participate in that if you want to. I should put this up there. But just get with me or Jerry, and we'll get you information on that if you want to participate in those. But you can also go to the YouTube channel, STF Apologetics Training. That's the name of the YouTube channel. So just do a search on that, and you'll find it. And you can watch the videos, as we've got several of them out now, and over the course of this next year, we'll be putting out more and more of those twice a month again. It's the first Sunday after the first Wednesday, and then 2 weeks later. And then we also have a Facebook Messenger chat group called Apologetics, STF Apologetics Training. And if you'd like to participate in that, just get with us and we'll add you to that group. And we're using that as an additional resource to ask questions, share information. We'll put links to other materials. We were talking with Sean Finnegan earlier about some stuff that he's got. We'll link to that in that group. And the idea is just to get as much resources and information and training as we can possibly get. And then you want to talk about that?
Yeah. The resources. Sure, but before we get there, I want to say one more thing about the apologetics training, is that what we're trying to get at is some of the deepest questions that people ask, and we want to just talk about them. A lot of the training that we do is people asking the questions that they have, because sometimes we've never really thought how we would explain ourselves. And I think that's a great part of the training. It's part of not just going to a self-defense seminar, but actually maybe getting a friend and going through a few potential encounters. I don't know if you've ever seen, there are some seminars that do encounters where you get to have a sort of get trained on how to experience an attack, and then what to do in light of that particular attack, whether they come from the side, from the back, from the front, if they have a weapon or not. I mean, a lot of people, they have no idea what to do unless they've actually been in that situation and thought about, okay, well, if this is the way they're coming at me, then I'm going to do this. Our apologetics training is a lot of just conversational dialogue on, okay, so if this is the question that's been asked by this person, or we've all probably encountered this type of question, you know, what are the ways that we can then begin to formulate a response? And it's really a great way to be introduced to the idea of apologetics and how to begin to explain some of these deep questions.
But for instance, one of the questions that we tackled a couple months ago was, why doesn't God reveal himself more clearly? It's a common question that people have. We actually asked the original people who were at the 20s and 30s conference and were interested in this stuff, we asked them, what are the questions that you want to see answered? And the most common one was that. You know, why doesn't God reveal himself more clearly to the world? Right? And right now we're going through a series on the problem of evil and the question of why is there so much evil? You know, why? You know, how do you explain if there's an all good, all powerful God who knows everything? Why in the world would there be so much evil? Right? So questions like that.
Yeah. And I think the last thing we're going to do is just give our recommendation on some of the best, most valuable introductory resources. Resources that you don't really have to have any prior experience in apologetics to be able to pick one of these books up and begin to read through and understand kind of the way to begin the journey of understanding apologetics. On Guard by William Lane Craig, excellent resource, goes through a lot of the traditional arguments for the existence of God. If somebody asks you, why do you believe God exists? I've never seen him. Well, there are actually some very thought-through explanations that people have offered to defend the reason why, you know, understanding the existence of God is not something irrational. There's actually good reasons to conclude God exists. But what are those? I don't know if everybody here could answer that question. I probably could have answered before I began my journey. But it's a very small introductory book, and William Lane Craig's writing style is very, it's very good. It's very engaging.
Accessible.
Yeah. Chad Meister's another one here with Building Belief. this would be a resource interested in, okay, well, if I get to the point where the person wants to know about Christianity, wants to know why I believe Christianity is true, why it explains reality, and why I think that the Bible is believable, Chad Meister goes through a lot of the core concepts of Christianity and helps to explain the easy, simple answers that you can give people to point them to the reasons why you believe the Christian faith is credible and believable and true. You want to talk about the other two?
Sure. Tactics, Greg Kokel's book, actually just saw he just came out with a new book. I get to read it. A very, very excellent book. And it's essentially focused on, in fact, I think John Vanderhoff was the person who turned me on to this book. It was really good. Thank you. It basically goes through a number of different tactics, and some of the things that we did today, like the questions, the Columbo questions, the taking the roof off questions, all that kind of stuff. It's got a lot more in that. It's a great resource for understanding some of the better ways to interact with people and trying to be like. He was the guy that we got the thing about putting a pebble in somebody's shoe. Just take a little. You may not even see that person ever again. Just put a little pebble in their shoe. And then finally, Nancy Pearcey, her book Total Truth, which I don't have on here, is it's a masterpiece, an absolute masterpiece. And I make an effort to read it every single year at least once. It's that powerful. And it really covers the whole gamut of the subject in just some very powerful ways. But this particular book, it's a little more difficult read than this one is. Finding Truth is that 5-step process.
Who's the author?
Nancy Pearcey. Pearcey. It's the one on the right up there. And her book, Finding Truth, is that 5-step process. And she's going to take that, we give you a quick overview, and she's going to elaborate on that throughout the whole book. It's an incredible book where she's going to give you powerful tools to recognize both where the person is coming from and understand what are the weak points in that. Where does that particular place fall down in terms of explaining reality? How does it self-contradict? All those kinds of things.
You're talking about Finding Truth or Total?
Finding Truth is the book that here. This Total Truth, I highly recommend it. It's definitely
shouldn't be your first read.
Oh, it's a big book. It's it's not necessarily big in size. It's sweeping in its scope, and it is an incredible read. But these are definitely books. If you want to get into this stuff, these 4 are books that you can easily get into and pick up and start running with. And then we've got 26 seconds left. Does anybody have a difficult question?
Yeah,
the use of twisting script. So when somebody twists a Bible verse to explain their view, I have no idea where to go. Like, for instance, homosexual saying, God is love. God wouldn't want me not to love if that's his nature.
So if I love murdering people, does that mean that God should respect my love?
No, of course not. Why? Okay.
Now that's an exaggeration. Jesus liked using exaggeration, right? But we might be able to find some other examples. I would always fall back on.
Just that was taking the roof off right there.
Yeah.
You are getting rained on big time.
But you can always fall back on, if you're not quite sure where to go with something, just start asking clarifying questions. Okay. And it'll start to, where'd you get that idea?
Where'd you get that? Okay.
Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, we'll be available if you have any more questions. Thank you. We're going to take a 30-minute break, and we're going to have some music when we come back in, so please stretch, get some coffee, or use the restroom, and we'll bring you back in 30 minutes. Thank you.